Piracy Paradox is a paradox related to fashion design, maybe related to other things, but mostly related to fashion design. The paradox arises from the following kind of puzzle, which is we usually think of intellectual property protection, copyright, for example, as a necessary element for creative production. So writers won't write if they think their books are just going to be copied. Musicians won't create music if they think their works are just going to be stolen. And so that's why piracy is such a problem. What's interesting about fashion design is you see a lot of creativity in the fashion world, and yet there's no protection for fashion designs. So dress appears on the runway on the Oscars, and the next day, 2 days later, you can buy a cheap version of that from a company like ABS. And so the piracy paradox looks at this puzzle, and the idea is that unlike other industries in which piracy seems to drive out creativity, in fashion, it doesn't drive it out, and in fact, it seems to accelerate it. And the reason is that the copying of designs as it spreads out into the marketplace makes the original buyer, the early adopter of a particular design, want to then move on to something new, right? So fashion's always cycling. And so one way to think about it is it accelerates the fashion cycle. So it's paradoxically helpful. A couple of implications. One is that our understanding of what creativity requires, which is a very instrumental one in the US legal system, needs to be a little more nuanced. And so when we think of it as a public policy question, to what degree should government provide these monopoly rights, which is what copyrights and patents and trademarks are, we need to think about how different industries, we need to be a little more industry specific. So rather than a blanket set of rules, we want to understand how these industries work and what kinds of inducements they need. So right now there's a bill before Congress to give fashion designers a kind of copyright, and that's probably not necessary, right? So, and there may be other cases in which it's not necessary. I think generally we're very aggressive about intellectual property in the U.S. We're quite eager to make sure that other countries protect our intellectual property. I think generally that's been helpful to us. We are the major producer of movies, or a major producer of movies, lots of other entertainment industries, software, et cetera. So intellectual property is essential to the American economy of the 21st century. And so we've been understandably aggressive about protecting it, and that I think has been good for our economy. But it's not just an economic question, right? So one of the things that we ought to think about when we're thinking about how much protection should be given is what should be in the public domain, what should be allowed as fair use, how long should the protection be? And there, I think there's a fair question to be asked about whether we have overshot what is reasonable. And so it's very difficult, for example, for musicians to sample other songs more than tiny little snippets, because the law has made it extremely complex and cumbersome and costly. And so many people argue that we've kind of gone well beyond what's reasonable and made the public domain, the domain of things that we can all use and remix and recreate, really inaccessible in a way that's probably not optimal. And we've done a couple of things to get around that. One is in the World Trade Organization, which countries like China are eager to be a part of, and they are in fact a member. We've made intellectual property part of that agreement, so part of that organization. So we have a set of IP rules that every member state of the WTO has to accept. And that linkage between trade and IP has been very effective. We do that in our bilateral trade agreements as well. We go and we say, you want a trade agreement with us, Peru or Colombia or whatever, Australia, great, but you have to accept a set of intellectual property rules and you have to enforce them. So, so we've used leverage against these countries. And, it's not perfect. So China still, you can travel in Asia. I was in Vietnam a few years ago, and pirated DVDs are everywhere, right? So it's not perfect, but we've been cracking down in a way that we hadn't in the past, and I think that has slowly moved these countries closer to our preferred position. It's had an enormous effect on piracy in that anything that's digital is music downloading. Anything that's digital is incredibly easy to copy, and therefore the piracy that goes on is rampant. So, 25 years ago, you wanted to copy a record, you had a cassette tape, it was complicated. Now it's a click and you're done. So technology's had an enormous effect, and that's what has driven a lot of the concern within the US over increasing IP protection and making sure that other countries in a global marketplace have the same sets of rules. Has technology been effective in fighting it? I suppose so, but I can't say I can think of an example. I think it's primarily been been something that's made the piracy problem larger. On the other hand, I think it's led to certain kinds of innovation in industries. So when the VCR came out, companies were very concerned it was going to be the end of the television industry. Not the case at all, right? So it ended up creating a whole new industry. iTunes is now this enormous company or enormous enterprise from Apple that didn't exist. So change brings opportunity in every economic domain, and I think IP is no different. Again, the question is how do you balance the incumbent industries against these unknown future things that we can't know or predict?